Welcome to the webinar on data for students with an IEP for intellectual giftedness. I am Nancy Williams, Gifted Education Specialist for the state of Tennessee. Here's the agenda for this webinar. We'll talk about the rationale and data parameters, go over the risk ratio, and then we'll go over some data samples, including under and overrepresentation by numbers and chart, risk ratio by race and a graph, our English learners and intellectual giftedness, and our economically disadvantaged and intellectual giftedness. So what's the rationale behind this? Why do we need to analyze our data on our gifted learners? Well, use of accurate data helps make decisions, including but not limited to screening, identification measures, service models, and personnel needs. Knowledge of accurate data will decrease the likelihood of underrepresentation and overrepresentation. Implementation of accurate data about gifted programs should help programs and services reflect the makeup of the general population. The data that we'll be looking at, the 2017 data, was drawn from Easy IEP. 2016 data is from the Student Management System. The data that we're going to review today includes representation type, under or over, percent gifted in total population, the comparison population to that, the risk ratio. Our EL data includes gifted percentage of total enrollment, gifted percentage of EL enrollment, and economically disadvantaged data. The overall data parameters. Depending on the source of data, it may be pulled on different dates, but that's marked at the top of the document and above any tables as needed. The EL data shown was correlated from Easy IEP and the WIDA data that we have. And when discussing risk ratio, remember that one is considered equally likely. Here is a sample with our statewide data. This is our under and overrepresentation by the numbers. On your tables, you will see your district LEA number and name, then the representation type of over or under. You'll see your cell data. If it was flagged, the top number besides where it was flagged tells you how many were in your district in the cell. The comparison population data, the resulting risk ratio, and the category, the racial or ethnic category that falls in. Line 1 shows that as a state, we have an underrepresentation of Hispanic. That was flagged, and the cell data of that was 720, with a comparison data being 102,650, resulting in a risk ratio of 0.45. That means a Hispanic student is at least half as likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. In our second line, we see that we have an overrepresentation in Asian, with that cell data size being 978, the comparison data across the state of 20,159, which is a risk ratio of 3.44. This means that you are almost 3.5 times more likely to be identified as intellectually gifted if you fall within the second race category. The statewide data has two areas of most concern. Most districts could have one or more areas to consider that show over and underrepresentation. The cell data is the number of students with an IEP for intellectual giftedness that fall within that specific race. In this example, out of 102,650 Hispanic students in the state, 720 have an IEP for intellectual giftedness, and out of 20,159 Asian students in the state, 978 have an IEP for intellectual giftedness. So what were the exact data parameters that we looked at? Districts were flagged if they met the following criteria. Had a minimum cell size of 5. That's the number of intellectually gifted students enrolled in a school district in a particular racial or ethnic group. Minimum in size of 20. That's the number of students enrolled in an entire school district in a particular racial or ethnic group. So the statewide chart for over and under represented that were flagged. These were the ones that were flagged for possible significant disproportionality. You can see the under and over categories that are highlighted. This table easily identifies the categories but does not give you the data behind the determination. The categories that are blank means the data at the time of the report was run did not indicate a disproportionality issue, or the minimum parameters from earlier were not met. The blank does not indicate a district might not be close to an over or underrepresentation in those categories. What is risk? Crucial area considered when identifying significant disproportionality is a measure of likelihood expressed as a percentage, is calculated by dividing the number of children from a specified racial or ethnic group who are, for example, identified as students with a disability by the total number of children from that group enrolled in the district. What is risk? Well, for example, if there are 40 Hispanic students identified with disabilities out of a total of 400 Hispanic students enrolled in the district, the risk of a Hispanic student being identified with a disability is 40 over 400, or 10%. What is a risk ratio? Numerical comparison of risk of a certain outcome for a specific racial or ethnic group and the risk of that same outcome for all other children in the district. It's calculated by dividing the risk of a particular outcome for a racial or ethnic group within a disability by the risk of that same outcome for all other racial or ethnic groups within the district, the comparison group. Example, in our previous example, risk for Hispanic students being identified with a disability is 10%. If 200 out of the 4,000 students remaining in 6 racial and ethnic groups are students with disabilities, then the risk of this comparison group being identified with a disability would be 200 over 4,000, or 5%. Thus, the risk ratio of Hispanic students being identified as students with disabilities would be 10% over 5%, or 2.0, twice as likely. Risk ratio. For overrepresentation, risk ratio of 3.0 or higher for a racial or ethnic group. That means that a particular racial or ethnic group meeting this criteria in a district is at least 3 times more likely to be identified as intellectually gifted when compared to all other racial or ethnic groups in the district. For underrepresentation, risk ratio of 0.5 or lower for a racial or ethnic group. That means that a particular racial or ethnic group meeting this criteria in a district is at most half as likely to be identified as intellectually gifted when compared to all other racial or ethnic groups in the district. For example, 8.24 number indicates that a student of this race in a specific district is 8.24 times more likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. A number of 0.14 indicates that a student of this race in a specific district is 86% less likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. So here's our statewide risk ratio. While only 2 categories, Hispanic and Asian, were flagged for under and overrepresentation, this table allows us to see how close other categories are to becoming flagged. With one being equally likely to be identified, the risk ratio indicates that a Hispanic student is 56% less likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. American Indian student is 1.19 times more likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. An Asian student is 3.44 times more likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. African American student is 43% less likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. Pacific Islander student is 16% less likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. A white student is 1.46 times more likely to be identified as intellectually gifted, and a multiracial student is 1.19 times more likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. Again, this is statewide data, and we can see from this table that the category of African American for the state is very close to the 0.5 cutoff threshold of being underrepresented. Here's a statewide disproportionality graph. I made this graph. Here's another way just to look at the data. You won't get this graph with your data. It was just a sample of something you might want to come up with. All of the statewide categories are listed. Drew a line for one being equally likely. It's just a great way to visually see how close or far away you are from that cutoff. Remember, 0.5 means underrepresented, And we can see here that Hispanic is underrepresented. African American is very close to being that cutoff. And 3 is overrepresented, which we can see Asian falls into overrepresented. Our English learner data parameters, gifted students are those who've been given a primary or secondary designation of intellectually gifted on their current IEP during the 16-17 school year. English learners are students who took the WIDA assessment during the 16-17 school year. And district enrollment was calculated using the district level membership file, which represents the district enrollment as of October 1st, 2016. Here is the graph, the chart for the statewide English learners. You can see the state has over 44,000 English learners out of a statewide enrollment of all students of over 1 million. Yet only 17 of those English learners have been identified as intellectually gifted. That gives the EL percent of total enrollment that have been identified as gifted. So gifted EL percent of total students at 0.09. So let's go through, now we've done the statewide data, now let's look at a full sample from a district. And this is a district here in Tennessee with the current data that we just went through on those dates. The sample district has 2 areas to look at. Most districts will have 1 or more areas to consider that show over and under representation. The cell data is the number of students with an IEP for intellectual gifted that fall within that specific race. In this example, out of 1,675 African American students, 10 have an IEP for intellectual giftedness, and out of 2,131 students, white students, 94 have an IEP for intellectual giftedness, and you can see their risk ratios listed. 2 areas were flagged or highlighted. This table easily identifies these categories but does not give you the data behind the determination. Again, the categories that are blank or have no flags on them means the data at the time of the report was run did not indicate a disproportionality issue or the minimum parameters from earlier were not met. The blank does not indicate a district might not be close to an over underrepresentation in those categories. While only 2 categories, African and American, were flagged for over and underrepresentation, this table allows the district to see how close other categories are to becoming flagged. With 1 being equal for this district, the risk ratio indicates that a Hispanic student is 71% less likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. American Indian student is 1.2 times more likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. Asian is 5.84 times more likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. African American student is 86% less likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. A white student is 5.72 times more likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. And a multiracial student is 63% less likely to be identified as intellectually gifted. And here's the sample graph that I put together for the district. Again, it is the choice of if you want a bar graph or a line graph. You don't have to make a graph at all if you don't want to. This was just something that I chose to do to help visually see where the different categories are falling. 1 is equally likely. 3 is overrepresenting, and you can see how far past that line of these 2 categories are. And 0.5 is underrepresentation. And you can see how far those other categories are from the other represented cutoff. Now, in the sample district English learners, on your report, you're going to see these percentages of English learners in total enrollment in your district. That's your first line. Then the gifted English learners percent of total enrollment. And finally, the gifted English learners percent of total gifted students. And in this district, you can see there were 0 students who were English learners also identified as gifted. So what are your next steps? This is what your report will look like that you will receive. And you can see that there are areas flagged for under and over representation in this district. It starts at the top with your percent gifted of total population in 2017. And then you can see your percent gifted of students with disabilities population from 2017. What has been flagged for significant disproportionality. If it has been flagged, it also has the cell data and the comparison numbers beside it. Looking forward down the report, you go back to 2016 for your EL and gifted data. And then at the bottom, you will see 3 lines from 3 past years for economically disadvantaged and gifted. These are percentages that you can then take back and take to the economically disadvantaged data you have in your district from those years from your total population and compare, because the intellectually disadvantaged percentages in your gifted population should be similar and reflect what you see in your general total school population. So what are your next steps? Ensure that multiple measures from multiple perspectives are being used. Evaluate and refine your district's child find process for intellectually gifted. Evaluate your identification procedures, including what is used as a screener, the age of screening, and the frequency of screening, and be intentional in the choice of evaluation measures used. As a district, look and see if this data is occurring at specific schools and not others. If it is, consider a district-level team looking at school-level data instead of the school looking at their own data. Actively include the English learner teachers in the referral process for your gifted students, and retrain personnel on the gifted evaluation process, uses of the TNASF, and considerations for assessing underrepresented populations. On your screen, you see the link and the click path for the evaluation guide. You might also need to go into that evaluation guide and look at some of the considerations for traditionally underrepresented students that are listed in the evaluation guide. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me through my email, nancy.e.williams@tn.gov. And this ends the webinar titled Data on Students with an IEP for Intellectual Giftedness. Thank you.